We now look at Plato's Epistemology and Metaphysics. Plato draws a distinction between opinion, mere belief, and knowledge. Now, in order to develop his theory of epistemology, he goes up against three main opponents: relativism, empiricism, and the view that knowledge is merely true belief. Relativism is a view that truth is, relative, that there is no objective truth. Empiricism is the view that knowledge of the world comes through the senses. And of course, the idea that knowledge is merely true belief is kind of self-explanatory. Now, we've seen Plato's arguments against relativism before, back in the discussion of the question of whether philosophy is just a matter of opinion. But to recap them, Plato does, of course, accept that some things are relative. For example, someone that's from a cold climate like Maine, what may feel warm to them may feel quite chilly to someone else. And what might feel pleasant to someone else may feel horribly hot to someone from a colder place. Now, Plato, speaking through Socrates, has two main arguments against relativism. One is general against relativism, and the other is an attack against Protagoras, an ad hominem. So his foe is Protagoras, a sophist. Protagoras claims that all opinions are equally true. Now, the obvious refutation is this: if all opinions are true, the opinions of his opponents, who believe he is wrong, their opinions would also be true. So, his belief would be false if those who disagree with him have true beliefs. So if he's right, he's wrong, and if he's wrong, he's, of course, wrong. And that is an argument against, relativism as being self-refuting. Socrates also has an ad hominem attack against Protagoras, which would not refute relativism, but is a pretty good shot against Protagoras. Protagoras, while claiming that all opinions are true, charged for his teachings. And when asked, why should people pay Protagoras to teach things if all opinions are true, Protagoras claimed he was teaching people what they needed to know. But once he claims his teachings are better than others, he's given up his relativism. Now again, this is an effective ad hominem against Protagoras, because if he says all opinions are true, but he's got the correct opinions, he's being inconsistent. But his inconsistency doesn't prove that relativism is false. So moving on to the senses. Plato has three main arguments against the senses. The first one is this: the problem of change. Plato claims that the senses only provide information about a world that constantly changes. Because of this, we cannot say what is true with certainty. We can only report how things appear or appeared at a particular time and place. For example, when I last looked at my truck, it was not on fire. But I'm not looking at it right now, so for all I know, it could be on fire. Hopefully not. So how does this count against the senses being the foundation of knowledge? Well, Plato argues that the objects of knowledge must not be so fleeting and so uncertain. They've got to be lasting, in fact, eternal, and certain. So the senses, since they are fleeting and uncertain, cannot be a source of knowledge. Now, of course, this could be countered. We're arguing that we may not be able to know exactly what's happening, say, now, but we can know things. So, for example, it could be contended that although I don't know if my truck is on fire now, when I was looking at it, I knew that it was not on fire. And there is always, of course, a counter in philosophy. Well, almost always. Second argument. The problem of the senses is this: Plato argues that the objects of knowledge must be universal and unchanging, and he also claims that there must be suitable, unchanging definitions for these objects. Why? Well, he claims that if we lacked such definitions and lacked such objects, and language only referred to the fleeting, changing objects of the world, meanings would constantly change, and language would not work. Now, there are many replies possible to this. One obvious one would be that things do change quite a bit, but they don't change radically enough or fast enough that it makes language not work. I mean, to use an obvious example, slang terms change pretty rapidly. The slang that was, the slang from a year ago is not the slang that is the, popular slang today. So the meanings do change, but it changes slow enough that some people, perhaps most people, can keep up. So there is a way to reply to that. There are also other replies as well. His third argument is the perfect standard argument, which is this. If we look at the world, we can see that the physical objects here fall short of perfection. One example would be justice. We don't see perfect justice here in this world. Also, hand-drawn shapes. If we compare them to the geometric notions of perfect circles and perfect squares, they obviously don't match up. And even if we were to print with a super high-quality laser printer a circle, if we were to examine it closely, we would see it was still imperfect. Now, there are many possible explanations as to how we realize that things fall short of perfection. But Plato's explanation is this. He claims that in order to know that things fall short, we must have knowledge about something perfect. And since all the things we see in the physical world are imperfect, then this knowledge cannot come from the senses. So our knowledge of perfection must come through something else, and so the senses cannot give us knowledge. Now, one somewhat interesting side to this is a very practical problem. As Plato noted, that the physical world is imperfect. So when you have these perfect concepts, like geometric shapes, etc., the physical world falls short. And this actually has some practical implications. For example, think about trying to measure distance. And normally when we do it, we use like a ruler or tape measure, and that's good enough. But when you get down to super precise, measuring like nanometer or smaller levels, we need really, really exact measurements. And an obvious question is, how do we know that like a meter stick is actually a meter? We need a standard for that. And what they used to use not so long ago was a bar made of a special metal stored in special gas under special conditions. But they found even that was not exact, because there would be shifts in temperature and gravity, however minute, but it would affect the length of the bar. And so no physical object can do this, because it's always going to be affected by conditions around it. It's always going to be imperfect. But we need really super accurate measurements. And what they do now is they define a meter as a wavelength of, certain wavelength of light, covering us, over a certain amount of time. But even that, of course, is running into problems. So I'm not claiming that Plato anticipated, this problem of perfect measurements, but it does sort of help to support his view, namely that we do have this concept of perfect things, and yet we find the physical world, even at super high resolution, falls short. And so he thinks we need something that is perfect. Next, he moves on to the idea that knowledge is right opinion, just believing something and being right. Now, he makes a distinction between just believing it and being right and knowing. What's the distinction? Well, for Plato, a true opinion is not willing to remain long, so they must be tied down by giving an account of the reason why. So he presents here the notion that you need to have a rational justification in order to claim that a belief is knowledge. And so we see the rise of the justified true belief. Now, given these arguments against relativism, against the senses, against knowledge just being true opinion, just being right, this lays out the standards for knowledge for Plato. So for Plato, what is required for knowledge in order to know? Well, knowledge has got to be for him objective, not coming through the senses. It's got to be universal, changeless, and based in reason. This leads, of course, to the obvious question, what could meet all these standards? And the answer, no spoilers because Plato's been dead a super long time, is of course Plato's forms. And next time we'll take a look at the forms.